Hi, my name is Mary Brownlee. I'm a licensed professional counselor. I'm starting this YouTube channel because it's a labor of love over many years. I have been working with highly traumatized patients and clients from a wide variety of backgrounds. It really has become my passion to work with people with high trauma levels. A lot of people don't know about childhood trauma and its impact on us as adults and throughout the human lifespan. I see this impact on a daily basis. I myself have been a survivor of childhood trauma as well, so a lot of this I know from the inside out. A lot of times, what I see in my office is a lot of people coming in with things like anxiety or depression or relationship difficulties, and they're really struggling, but they don't actually connect it to early childhood experiences. And so, hence, the journey starts with me explaining a lot of what I will be sharing on my channel. It's really important to me to get this message out there. So many people don't understand the impact of adverse childhood experiences. So many people don't understand why they come in feeling empty or misunderstood or lacking in close, loving relationships in their lives. They struggle with things like low self-worth, struggling to even know who they are as a person, really feeling a lot of like emptiness and helplessness and a loss of control. So a lot of this stems in our childhood. It's kind of where all of these things start. And so it's been important to me to share this message. I want to reach as many people as I can. I know that not everybody can afford therapy. Not everybody has easy access to therapy, much less a trauma therapist, which is my specialty. And so much in mental health, what people come in with mental health disorders is actually trauma-based. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk is probably one of my favorite trauma experts. He has written the book, The Body Keeps the Score. I myself was lucky enough to attend one of his in-person trainings, and he really has said the majority of what the DSM-5, our big diagnostic and statistical manual of mental health disorders, most of that is based in childhood trauma. So that kind of gives you an idea of just how big and pervasive this type of damage can do. And a lot of people don't know either. Anything about adverse childhood experiences. A lot of times I ask people, have you ever heard about ACEs or an ACE score? And people are like, nah, I've never heard of that. And I ask people, have you heard of complex PTSD? No, I haven't heard of that. What is that? And a lot of times what clients are coming in to see me is actually complex PTSD or high adverse childhood experiences. And so we'll talk a little bit about that today and how that can really impact us as human beings across the lifespan, not just in childhood, but adulthood as well. So I'll be linking a few really important resources below. The first one comes from the ACEs Too High website, which really covers the predominant amount of research that has been done on adverse childhood experiences. I tell all my clients the reason why this is so important to know is because it actually impacts your physical health too, not just your mental health. So a lot of trauma survivors come in with a frequent amount of disorders in the body as well, like autoimmune disorders. I see like mast cell disorder, POTS disorder, some of the more rare disorders, Crohn's disease, IBS, people with migraines or chronic pain. I see a lot of that too. And so there is some research, especially coming from the trauma field, that shows why these type of disorders happen to the physical body as well when we have a childhood that's high in trauma. So what is trauma? And what is an ACE score? So yeah, let's dive right in and figure that out. So an ACE score stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. So just like it sounds, it's a negative childhood experience. The ACE screener, the original ACE screener that came out of the Adverse Childhood Experience study has 10 questions. But even still, and from my experience too, professionally, there's a couple extra questions that they missed on this, but it's at least a good idea of kind of the exposure that a person has been through. So for example, we ask clients before the age of 18, so before their 18th birthday, what type of exposures do they have? For example, the first one is, and I'll read it off my computer here so you can actually get a gist of what this e-screener is going to ask you. Did a parent or other adult in the household often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid you might be physically hurt? Yes or no? So basically, if that happened to you as a child before the age of 18, you would check mark yes. So that would be an A score of 1. The second question is, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? Yes or no? So again, you would check mark yes or no, and if you happen to be 2 yeses at this point, it would be an A score of 2. The third question is asking if anyone ever sexually abused you. So anyone over 5 years of age or older than you ever sexually abuse you or touch you inappropriately, that type of experience, yes or no. Question 4 asks, did you often or very often feel that no one in the family loved you or thought you were important or special, or your family did not look out for one another, feel close to one another, or support one another? So what this is looking at is emotional neglect. So a lot of people have never heard of the term emotional neglect. That is something that I talk about with a lot of my clients. And what's so interesting about emotional neglect is the research shows that this particular aspect is more harmful than physical abuse. So that is how damaging it is to the developing human brain. We were wired for social connections as human beings, and if we don't have safe, loving social connections in our most formative years, bad things can happen in the body and the brain. So emotional neglect is a very serious aspect that so many of my clients come in with a lot of pain from, and they don't even know where this pain is coming from until we talk about a lot of these things. So question 5 asks, did you often or very often feel that you did not have enough to eat, or had to wear dirty clothes, or had no one to protect you, or your parents were too drunk or high to take care of you or take you to the doctor if needed? So this is medical neglect and like failure to meet a child's basic needs. So we see this, for example, with a lot of parents who struggle with substance use, and it's at a extremely high level of disorder at this point. And they're failing to meet their child's basic needs, whether that's the child going to school with dirty clothes all the time, the parent isn't attending doctor's appointments or taking the child to the doctor when needed. They're missing large amounts of school, for example, because the parents are, again, using substances and not really parenting at a high level. So yeah, that's that type of adverse childhood experience. Question number 6. Were your parents ever separated or divorced? Surprise! Something as simple as separation or divorce is traumatic to developing children. Children always take divorce, for the most part, pretty hard. So I've met quite a few adults that have discussed a parent's divorce even, and the impact that that had on them. So yeah, that's always a stressor that kids go through when a parent's divorce or separate. Question 7 is related to domestic violence. So it asks, was your mom or stepmom often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her, or sometimes or often kicked, bit, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard, or ever repeatedly hit over at least a few minutes or threatened with a gun or knife? And what I always tell my clients on this question is, let's widen the lens to more than just your mother. Like if you witnessed another family member doing any of these particular behaviors, that is going to be childhood trauma. And it most definitely will even impact not only on the developing brain, but the emotional world and the sense of safety, and create hypervigilance and other symptoms of trauma that we'll go over in a little bit. Question 8, did you ever live with anyone who was a problem drinker or an alcoholic or who used street drugs? And so this question is, again, really referring to a parent with a substance use disorder. And unfortunately, this is something that I see all too often as well. Parents who struggle with substance use disorders are often not parenting the best that they can, and oftentimes actually the parent has high ACEs as well. So they're dealing with their own childhood trauma through the use of a substance use disorder. And I'll get to more of that related topic in other videos as well, because ACEs are directly related to substance use as well. Let's see. Question 9, was a household member depressed or mentally ill or attempt suicide or completed suicide? That's going to be another pretty negative childhood experience. So a lot of people come in, and when they describe their childhood to me, it's clear that the parent, their parent, was suffering from a mental illness. And so, yeah, that will absolutely impact the way a child is raised, how they feel about themselves. Depending on the behaviors that the parent demonstrates, it can really lead to a lot of hypervigilance and a lack of safety in the world. So, yeah, this can also really be a pretty negative impact on a child. And then the last one asks, did a household member ever go to prison? So pretty self-explanatory. If a parent goes to prison, that relationship is broken. And so if a child doesn't have access to mom or dad for long periods of time, that obviously would be quite negative as well. And then, one other thing that I definitely think should have been on here and is not on here is like things like childhood bullying. So if a child's going through like extensive experiences with childhood bullying, that's going to really negatively impact the brain as well. So now that we kind of know what the ACEs are, maybe you've been keeping track and you kind of have an idea of what your ACE score means. Well, what now? Maybe you have a very high ACE score. A lot of my clients come in with 6, 7, 8, 9, on their ACE screeners. I myself have an ACE score above 4. And so that's kind of what the research has shown is anybody with an ACE score above 4 is at a much higher risk for certain outcomes. And the reason for that is because chronic childhood stress and trauma actually releases stress hormones in the body. It's cortisol, it's adrenaline. These are not good for our bodies to be experiencing for a high level of time. Cortisol and adrenaline is great in the short term to help us survive, say, a threatening event. Like if a tiger is launching itself, from a bush somewhere. Thank goodness we don't live usually most of us don't live in a place where tigers exist. But say hypothetically a lion or a tiger leapt out from a bush at you, you would need adrenaline and cortisol to help you survive and stay safe by running away, by potentially trying to fight the tiger off, or like even the freeze response. So that's another thing I'll have to go into it with another video is the different trauma responses. So these are the fight, flight, freeze. A lot of people have heard of those, but they haven't heard of the fourth one, and that's called fawn. Fawn is people pleasing. So people pleasing happens when, for example, we live in a family where there's a high degree of control usually. There's a high degree of scapegoating that usually goes on. We'll talk about that if you don't know what that is. And a lot of times people don't feel safe to be themselves. And so what ends up happening is they kind of people please and put their needs last and kind of walk on eggshells and keep the abuser or the unhealthy person happy so that they are not further abused. So all of these trauma responses, and we do call them trauma responses, are not done with any type of conscious thought. It's an automatic response, just like the snap of a finger that the brain takes to try to stay safe. So these are largely unconscious, very immediate and quick responses that people have to a threat in the environment, like one of these adverse childhood experiences. So back to talking about adrenaline and cortisol, if you have negative ACEs going on at a very high degree for a long period of time, what happens is adrenaline and cortisol can break down the body over time. And not just the brain, but the actual physical body. So high ACEs has also been correlated with like negative health outcomes. So we do see incidents, for example, and this is what the research has shown, of things like cardiovascular events, strokes, even like early death and cancer, again, from those extremely toxic stress hormones that should not be in the body on a chronic basis. They are in trauma survivors. And high ACEs also has been linked to things like higher level of mental health disorders, depression, anxiety, PTSD, things like borderline personality disorder is caused by childhood trauma. So yeah, a lot of these is really not good for our mental health, not good for our physical health. And so you may be thinking at this point, well, crap, my ACE score was like 8. What the hell am I supposed to do now? No worries. No worries. Thank God the brain is remarkably resilient. We know the brain has plasticity, which is another term that neuroscience has given us, that the brain, it has a great capacity for change. And so that's the good news. You're not stuck with some of these trauma responses and these high degree of distress in the body and the brain and the emotions the rest of your life. We are also, and thankfully, quite resilient as human beings. And so there are some things that increase our resilience. Things like having a safe social networks of people maybe that we've met as an adult. Maybe we have colleagues or co-workers or friends we've built as adults that really love us and care for us and want the best for us. That's going to be something that really helps these the high A scores and these negative outcomes to decrease. Things like having a community, whether it's church or a set of spiritual beliefs that you really find peace and some lessening in your suffering, that's helpful as well. So yeah, we'll talk a little bit more too in other videos what can really help the body and the brain and the mind and the emotions recover from trauma, because it really is holistic. A lot of people think trauma is just stored in our memories. It's not. It's also stored in the body. So that's kind of what's come out of the research as well. So you have to incorporate the body to also heal trauma symptoms. Dr. van der Kolk has been really a great advocate for encouraging trauma treatments to include the body as well. So yeah, to give you an idea, I use with my clients internal family systems therapy. You probably have never heard about it, but if you have, awesome, bonus points. But IFS is really working with the wounded parts that we get from childhood and helping to reduce the amount of distress that the wounded parts are carrying, as well as how often that they kind of act out. And as I like to say, drive the bus. Wounded parts really are based in survival responses. When we have something in our environment that triggers us, boom, wounded part acts out, drives the bus, usually by some sort of behavior that's actually not helpful for us. But again, the wounded part's like, ooh, this will help me stay safe. And lo and behold, inevitably the person, usually over a period of years, they're coming into a therapist like, I do not feel good and my life is a hot mess. I need help. And so I love working with trauma and I love working with wounded parts, because IFS, being my favorite approach, it's not the only approach to treating trauma, but it's my favorite approach, is really a compassionate, gentle approach to working with all of these wounded, traumatized parts that we can get from childhood trauma. And I'll talk more about that as well. I think we'll be using some IFS and talking about IFS as well, because I have been definitely, this is my own personal thoughts on treating trauma as both a survivor and as a therapist. I've gone, different stages of my life, from really exploring things like narcissistic abuse, forums for survivors, watching tons of YouTube videos that were actually very helpful at the time in explaining all the different terms of like narcissistic abuse and all the different behaviors that can come out of these type of family systems. And that was great. That educational component was really helpful. And I think that's one piece of the puzzle, but it doesn't encapsulate, well, what do I do now? I have all these wounds from my family, and I understand where they came from now. I understand it wasn't my fault, but what do I do now? And IFS is the answer to that. So IFS is beautiful. It helps us become more in touch with who we authentically really are, minus the trauma. And it really strengthens our ability to communicate with our own wounds from a compassionate, loving place, begin to understand ourselves deeply, and to really increase that wise type of self energy instead of wounded parts. So yeah, again, we'll talk more about that in other sessions, but I kind of wanted to throw it out there as okay, I may have these high A scores, but what now? So the way I see treating trauma is more of a kind of a holistic approach that grabs from a bunch of different modalities and research. I grab from neuroscience. I grab from, cognitive behavioral therapy and how our thoughts can impact our emotions, but also a heavy psychoeducational component too. It really helped me to understand how my own trauma impacted me. It really did help me to feel less out of control and less helpless. So I always include that as well. That's a very important part of the puzzle to healing. But things like mindfulness and compassion and acceptance and things like yoga, even, or some of those body methods too. Yoga, Pilates, dance, things like that can also be helpful. So we will definitely dive into all of these topics in a lot more detail. I really hope this channel will continue to grow, and I hope it will be helpful for you. This is something close to my heart. It's something I want to freely provide to anyone who feels lost with a high degree of trauma, so that they too can begin to understand how to heal. And I do believe we all have the power within us to self-heal. Sometimes we need a little guidance, a little bit of a lighthouse out there to direct us in the right direction, but you, all of you out there, have the capacity to self-heal. And so that is what this channel is about. It is my honor to speak and get to know all of you who hopefully will join me. And I am very open to questions. So if you have questions or comments, feel free to leave them below, and I will begin to link all of these wonderful resources I mentioned today. And so I look forward to producing more videos, and it was very nice meeting all of you. And I hope that you all take care. And I want to close with, you are worthy, you are valuable, you are lovable. You may not feel that way right now, but trust me, you can get there. Take care.